Hi, everybody. It's Mary Rowe from the Canadian Urban Institute. Very, very pleased to be coming at you live and in person. Actually, we have a hybrid event going on here in Halifax, which has been a treat for us. We've been here all week. And this is the actual traditional ancestral name is Mi'kmaq, which is the traditional territory of the Mi'kmaq people. We've also had a really, I would say, serious and profound experience here working alongside people of African descent who are part of the rich tradition here of settlement in the Halifax region. And we've spent several days learning and listening and watching and walking in the communities where the African Nova Scotian community settled over 400 years ago. And that is part of the Truth and Reconciliation journey here to include not just Indigenous populations, but also the African descent communities. And it's been a really privilege for us to learn and appreciate some of the historical struggle, but also the ways in which these communities are continuing to reimagine their future and deal with the legacies of exclusion. We talked a lot at CityTalk about the history of exclusion around urban planning. You can really see it here, but how these communities have started to come to terms with that and move forward in really interesting ways. And what a treat for us to be joined for this CityTalk with our colleagues in Victoria, who are also on a journey of reconciliation and truth. And today we've released the Victoria Nurtures report. So I'm going to encourage my fellow panelists to come on, turn their cameras on, and so people can get a chance to hear from everyone what their perspectives are on this issue. And we were interested to put these two cities together, both because we've been doing CUI locals in both. We did one in Victoria last fall, and we're here just finishing one in Halifax, but also just the interesting elements that are common to these two cities, coastal, mid-size, and have some interesting characteristics during post-COVID. For instance, both cities, you have the lowest vacancy rates of any cities in the country. You've also, I think, are both two of the fastest growing cities. Those probably go together, those stats. But you're coastal, you have resilience challenges, but you also have all these remarkable assets that you're building on. So we're going to get a chance to hear from everybody about this. But just before we start, I just want to introduce my colleague, Abigail Moria, who will put her camera on, I hope, so you can get a look at her. There she is. And she's about 8 feet from me here at the Halifax Central Library. And she's going to help moderate this discussion. I don't think, is your camera on? Yes, it is. But we're navigating the multiple microphones. So if you hear feedback, sorry, guys, we're doing the best we can. We don't have any excuse that the West might have, because the West, of course, is 3 hours behind and they need lunch. We've had lunch here. So we should be as high functioning as we possibly could be. Anyway, we also have a live audience here in the wonderful Halifax Central Library that is just behind a glass wall here, watching us on a big screen. I would encourage everyone to participate in this session by throwing questions into the chat or comments into the chat. Just keep in mind, we record these sessions, and anything that goes in the chat stays in the chat, and we will publish it. So keep that in mind when you put your comments there. And then I'll make sure that the participants get a chance to respond to whatever it is you're raising there. And then they, of course, will talk amongst themselves. And Abigail and I will be here traffic copping to make sure that nobody speaks over anybody else. But again, we're really pleased to have this chance to just take an hour. And it happens, as I say, to be in conjunction with the release of the CUI report called Victoria Nurtures that reflects our experience with the City of Victoria and with the Victoria Foundation last fall. So lots to talk about. And I just want to welcome everybody. Councillor, Mason, nice to have you. Cynthia Dorrington, CUI board member and resident here in Halifax business person. Christina, nice to see you from the Songhees First Nation in what she tells me is sunny South Island. That's nice. And then, of course, the Mayor Help. So we might actually go to you first, Mayor Help, to just give us a couple of, you remember the CityTalk audience, we're across the country. It's really good for people to get a chance to get a bit of a snapshot of what's working, what's not, what's next. And so maybe you can just take a few minutes, Mayor Helps, to start us. Then I'll come to you, Christina, and then I'll swing to the East Coast before we have a kind of collaborative conversation. So give us the high and low points, can you, Mayor Helps, and get us started. Thanks.
Sure. Thanks, Mary. Hello, everyone. As Mary says, I'm Lisa Helps. I'm the mayor of Victoria, and I am here in Victoria on the traditional lands of the Lekwungen-speaking people, the Songhees and the Esquimalt nations. And here in Victoria, we are working on a very deep and heartfelt and intimate journey of reconciliation with the Lekwungen-speaking people, the Songhees and the Esquimalt nations. We learn together, we eat together, we share together. We fail often at the city to live up to our responsibilities, and we're shared very kindly and generously with what we need to do better next time. Yeah, it's really meaningful and an honor to be governors on the lands here that belong to other people, and we take that responsibility just as seriously as we can. In terms of what's working, what's not, and what's next, as Mary says, today we did, or CUI did release Victoria Nurtures, which really was a deep dive last October with our community. There it is, you can read it online. And it was really interesting. A lot of people who came to or participated in Victoria Nurtures wondered if this was specifically an EDI, an Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion Conference. And it wasn't specifically that. It was CUI X Victoria, Vital Conversations for Our Shared Future. And almost all, if not all of the panels and the conversations really privileged and foregrounded the voices of equity-seeking groups. So we had a panel from the African descent community. They had just opened a fantastic exhibition at the museum called Hope Meets Action, Echoes Through the Black Continuum in British Columbia. We had members of the Indigenous city family. We had the Aboriginal Coalition to End Homelessness, a really amazing, courageous panel that's 3 hours long with Muslim women telling their stories. And so I think what's working is that we are in Victoria, not just in CUI X Victoria, but we're really privileging and foregrounding the voices that have been, and the experiences that have for way too long been marginalized. And so I think that's really working. And what that's doing is it's giving us richer, more resilient, more heartfelt solutions for moving forward on all of the challenges we're facing: homelessness, the vacancy rate, the opioid crisis, reconciliation. So if we, so that's really what's working, that we're approaching these in new ways with I would say new participants leading the way, not just like one person of African descent on each panel, but panels made up of people who are seizing their moment in Victoria. And I think that's really working. I think what's not is the same thing that's not working across the country. Cities are increasingly unaffordable. There's a growing disparity between people who have a place to live and have a secure job and people who don't. There's the opioid crisis. There's the continued, even though we're doing really good work on reconciliation in Victoria, there's a disproportionate number of people who are living on our streets who are Indigenous. So that's one of the things that's not working, and I don't think that's unique to Victoria. I think that is across the country. And then what's next? I'm going to stop talking because I realize I've done it for a while. I talked for a while. So what's next is this conversation and learning together today. Thanks, Mary.
Thanks, Mayor Helps. You'd be interested if you, several times through the last several days here in Halifax, I've thought of our Victoria colleagues and how resonant a lot of the conversations that are taking place here are conversations that are taking place there. I always say that in Canada, we don't do horizontal very well. The country is organized top, vertical, from the feds to, I bet the Councillor Mason will agree with me, from the feds to the province to the local municipalities. And we don't do horizontal very well. And here we are at the other end of the country, having a lot of the similar kinds of conversations to what we had with you in Victoria. So there's something powerful about us stitching together these narratives, I think, across different jurisdictions. I also just want to acknowledge, I appreciate people are using the chat to tell us where they're coming in from. And lo and behold, the much beloved and much missed former technical producer of CityTalk, now with the Downey Wenjack Fund, and who ran all the technical support for us at CUI Victoria, Jamie Bastian, is in the house. She is on the chat. Jamie, we're glad to have you back to us, and I'm sure you've been waiting with a great anticipation to see the report from the series of sessions that you helped actually produce in Victoria. So Jamie, nice to see you. Christina, let's go to you next, if we could, to give us a different perspective and to hear what you are sort of observing as what's working, what's not, and what's next. Great to have you with us.
Great, thank you. And thank you, Mayor Helps, for your words and for your acknowledgement of the Lekwungen people. So I'm representing the Lekwungen people. I'm not Lekwungen, I'm Labrador Métis. My mother was born in Newfoundland and my ancestors are from Labrador on my mother's side. But I've been working with the Lekwungen people for 27 years now. And from 1995, and walking with them on the journey of trying to reemerge in their own territory, socially, culturally, economically, and the challenges that have been met by that. And what has been working is relationship building. And our chief Ron Sam very much came into his leadership with a mindset of, we need to be talking to our neighbors. We need to be working together. We need to understand what's happening with them. They need to understand us. And so that external focus led us to developing relationships and putting a lot of resources to them. And that includes the city family and working with the city of Victoria. And when you do that work, you get down to the people level. It's individual people, change makers, and people that are working in this community and engaging with them and getting to understand them. And that is working. What's not working in an Indigenous context is the fact that the land offices are overburdened with efforts to consult and engage, coming from all directions, coming from government, from industry, coming from groups that want to do reconciliation work. There's a tremendous amount of opportunity that's coming to the nations. The challenge is they don't have an Indigenous engagement officer to match all of the engagement officers that are out there. In fact, we're getting poached in our communities for people to go work for industry. And it's very challenging, and industry is finding it challenging to engage with the nations because maybe they don't get a reply to an email because it's just lost in all of the noise. So in some of our work, responding to that in the context of COVID, and we formed, as folks may know about, the Rising Economy Task Force, spearheaded by the South Island Prosperity Partnership. And that included all of the members of that organization right across the economy. So it's local governments, it's First Nations, it's educational institutions, it's industry. And we all came together, formed a number of different committees. I think there might have been 15 different committees. I co-chaired the Indigenous Economy Committee. And so my role was to work with others to go out speak with, there are 10 First Nations on the South Island, and a Métis community and an Indigenous urban population that comes from all across Canada. And so our job was to engage with those folks and get feedback about what's needed right now and what's needed to recover from COVID. And what we learned from that actually is that COVID just magnified existing problems. The problems were still there, the impacts of them were greater, and the ability to respond to them was lessened. And so one of the things that folks have identified that's desperately needed is a center, a place where we can, a navigator hub, if you will, a place to engage, for the nations to engage with one another and to engage with industry and with local governments. And so we're forming the Indigenous Prosperity Center. So there's a Indigenous Prosperity Center working group, and we have 5 co-chairs. And that was actually the first innovation. That was because we're structured during this incubation phase as a committee of the board of directors of CIP. And they asked us to name a chair and a co-chair so we could fit into their governance model. And we came back with 5 co-chairs. And it was kind of a fun problem to look at, because we said, this is the first time we're asking you to put a circle in a square hole. And we've got to figure out how to make this work, because this is just the beginning. So we're going to look at those governance models, a circular governance model. And one comment I have from what I heard before is about when you bring more voices to the table, the innovation that's possible is wonderful. And it's partly because of the exclusion. And I see this from the context of being in an Indigenous community and problem solving when you're not in the box. You're literally outside of the box thinking, because you don't know how mainstream system is doing it. You're outside that. So you figure out the best way to handle something, the best way to work through a problem. And what we would discover when we got to the solution is that we'd actually made an innovation that was better. We did something wiser than other folks had done. We brought humanity into the equation, is usually what it is. And so we have so much to gain from tapping into the talent that we have equally distributed across this country in all groups, but we haven't heard from those voices, and those voices will benefit from being at the table, but the whole country benefits from those voices at the table. So.
Wow, Christina, you're raising again all sorts of things that are resonant everywhere. This notion that bands are over consulted, the band offices don't have the capacity, the First Nations offices, everybody wants to have an opportunity. And then, as you say, it's exhausting and there aren't resources to support the consultation. So we really hear that. Interestingly, also the comment about re-emerging, supporting communities to re-emerge in their territory. I love that, that framing. And I would say I'm going to pass to Abigail because we just had two days where we were in two parts of Halifax where I would say that language, Abigail, would be similar, that the African Nova Scotian community is trying to re-emerge in their traditional territory. So I'll pass to Abigail, who's a planner, by the way, and is very familiar with the legacies of how urban planning has continued to be exclusionary. So I'll pass to you, Abigail, to then draw in our colleagues from Halifax.
Great, thanks, Mary. So I'm going to start with Cynthia, because I know that you've been on some of the walks with us at visits to the community. And really what stood out to me with what Christina just said is that idea about re-emerging socially, culturally, and economically. And I know, Cynthia, you've talked about this, the need to have the voices at the table and why that's important. So yeah, what are you seeing? What's happening? What's not working and what's next?
I think what's working here in Halifax is since COVID, we know the social construct of what happened over the last 2 years and what has arisen as a result of George Floyd and the inequities that rose to the top. And being a province that has over 400 years of African Nova Scotian ancestry here, it really does talk to the fact that not everybody was heard, not everybody was listened, and things weren't treated fairly. And that was common. That's nothing new at all. But I think the approach that we are doing now as a city and also from the African Nova Scotian community is that we're looking at it in a way that is meaningful. We're trying to meet and listen to people in an approach that we're open. We acknowledge the fact that things did not always happen the way they should have happened in the past. But most importantly, we're talking to the community because we have to have the community guide us. This can't be a Eurocentric, top-down approach. It has to be a community approach. We have to meet them where we're at because of the marginalization and racism that was entrenchment here in this part of Canada. We have to actually acknowledge that, and I think meeting them where they're at, understanding and listening, and then trying to find new ways to approach how we move forward in a collective and respectful manner, because that's when we actually get the best of people, when they're actually listening, they're actually engaging, and they actually want to affect difference. So I think we have, from the African Nova Scotian communities, we have 52 historic Black communities that root back to the 1700s. So ultimately, the communities here in HRM and the city council and staff are working closely with the communities now, and the communities have come together to say, this is what we need, and this is how we want to approach it. And I think the city is now starting to look at that and approach it in that manner. I think what's not working is we have to understand that you can't paint all the communities with the same brush. As an African Nova Scotian myself, from a community outside of HRM, our community, although being part of African Nova Scotian community, the broader perspective, we have unique differences. And I think we can't label everybody with the same common issue or concern. I think we have to listen to the community. And there's a great saying that one of the key people that have been involved in helping with the Road to Economic Prosperity for African Nova Scotians and developing a pathway forward, she made a comment that there are communities within a community, and we have to address them as such. We have to understand the uniqueness of those various communities within the broader community. And I think HRM is starting to look at that and address it in a manner that's respectful, and they're actually listening and working and developing a new model, I believe, on how to really build a community, with not only within the community building up themselves, but within a city environment. What's not working, I think, is we need to really ensure that we have more engagement with the various communities, because we're all at different starting points. And sometimes we don't believe that, we think that, oh, everybody's at the same space and the same place, but we're not. It's very important that you understand the community, what the community needs are, because the community needs, again, are uniquely different. I can look at Africa and Nova Scotia. There are some basic things that are similar across all the various communities, but when I'm looking at individual communities, the need is different. And I think we have to acknowledge that. And I think ultimately, with that knowledge, having the city understand that, okay, we put a program and it should impact everybody. It's not going to impact everybody. It will impact some communities differently than other communities, because that's probably maybe what not the community did not need that. They needed something different. So we have to look at it in a unique way and address it in a way that is meaningful for the community and just not the city.
Great, thanks, Cynthia. I think a lot of points I'd like to pick up on later on, but right now I'm going to move to Councillor Mason to ask a few questions. So, like during our week so far, we've had a chance to talk with a number of city staff in areas such as economic development, thinking about diversity and inclusion, as well as transit, housing. Those are some of the themes that came up. So I'd love to understand from your perspective, with everything that's happening in Halifax right now, a lot is happening in HRM. What do you think is working, and etc. What next? And
I have 2 minutes, right? Two
Yes,
minutes to tell you what's working, what's not. Okay,
yeah.
No problem.
And what's next?
Well, I want to start, as Mayor Helps did, just to acknowledge that Halifax Regional Municipality is located in Mi'kma'ki, the ancestral and traditional and unceded lands of the Mi'kmaq people, and that the municipality acknowledges the peace and friendship treaties signed in this territory and recognizes we are all treaty people. And we started doing the acknowledgement. We came back, Mayor Helps love this. Literally, the mayor's in line with me at the airport leaving FCM Vancouver going, why don't we do what Gregor kept doing in 2013? It was not done in Nova Scotia or Atlantic Canada. And we worked with Aboriginal Affairs at the province, came up with some words and started doing it. Now it has done, but it's done so much that people now question the value of doing it. And so I want to ground that in actual things we are doing, which is just this week, the mayor and myself were up at Shubenacadie is what it used to be, Sebenanacadie, and meeting with the traditional Grand Council for the district and with the Band Council for the that's created by the federal government, talking about how we can all work better together. And this work happens, I would say now it's gone from a very occasional to never thing 10 or 15 years ago to an everyday thing that we're all trying to work very hard to be committed to. And I think people, for those who are online watching who aren't in Halifax or aren't familiar with Halifax, you'll hear us you've heard us primarily talking about 2 historic communities in Halifax that have been underserved and systematically denied services in the past: the African Nova Scotian community and the First Nations, the Mi'kmaq community. And it's difficult to undo 400 years of systematic discrimination and in a single political term, or I've been on council for 10 years. But all you can do is you can keep trying to do the right thing and engaging. It's very intimidating to follow Cynthia Dorrington, by the way. It's just like what she said. I'm done. But an example she spoke about is the Roads to Prosperity, African Nova Scotian Economic Development Strategy, is something that was led by the African Nova Scotian community and supported by Halifax Partnership, our economic development arm, and HRM, and is resourced in part by those organizations. And to really focus on listening to the community and hearing about how they've had historic and longstanding roadblocks or current roadblocks, and then try and build a framework that you can support through your infrastructure to make sure those voices are heard and those issues are addressed is new work for us. And that is something, as sadly, I think it did take things like George Floyd. I think Cynthia is exactly right to finally move that to the top of the agenda for the business community. At the same time, the Mayor Helps talked about, and Mary talked about how we are two of the fastest growing cities, unexpectedly so during COVID, accelerated during COVID. We thought that when international travel stopped, that we might get a breather and be able to catch up, and interprovincial exceeded what we'd had in international, and the population continued to grow at rates that were unthinkable 5 years ago. And so we have this housing crisis and all these issues happening, and then the of course Black Lives Matter became a issue that really gripped this community because of our history, because Africville happened just before I was born, and you should Google it. That's a whole other conversation. But in 1968, the historic African Nova Scotian community on the peninsula in the center of Halifax was leveled by the city, expropriated and leveled. Families were moved out in the back of city dump trucks. I know people who grew up there, who are friends of mine, just a little older than me, who remember that happening to them. It's not an ancient history thing. It's still a current thing that works down through the generations. So how do we work together to rebuild and bring back into the light these communities and make sure that everybody is being treated, with justice and equality, and I think that the road to prosperity strategy is a key piece there. The defunding and retasking police, the apology from Halifax Regional Police for street checks, those are all great, but now we're getting down to the tactical things, like when the Utility Review Board redistricted the city in 2011 because the politician, I wasn't one of them, tried to gerrymander all the districts, so the Utility Review Board rejected it and imposed their own. They divided historic Black communities. So Preston's and Cherrybrook weren't in one community. I represent part of a historic Black community, even though I'm the South End councillor, because they put the boundary on Cornwallis Street and divided the North End between myself and Lindell Smith. Though a lot of people in that community have come to feel it's good they have two councillors who have to come when they call, and we do. But the political boundaries piece, or even a lot of the roads in the rural Black communities, are provincial roads, and it's taken years to convince the province that maybe we should let there be crosswalks on these highways in these historic communities so people can get from the daycare to the public school without taking their lives in their hands every day. So those are the kind of things that we're getting down into that level of discussion about how do we make this fair and fix what's right, and that will take generations. And then on the First Nations side, we are working toward a similar goal. I'm on the on the Halifax Partnership Board, and the intention was optimistically a year ago, now we're going to do the same thing and have a road to prosperity for the Mi'kmaq and First Nations people. We had not done the spade work to build the relationships and to understand the challenges, and it's a different set of challenges. Of course, they're similar, but an entirely different thing, especially when you factor in the fact that we're talking about a different sovereignty and the treaties and all the rights and responsibilities that come with that. And so I am, we are hopeful that work will continue to build towards something over the next couple of years. But a lot of things are moving at the same time. There's been a couple of additions to reserve in Halifax Regional Municipality. One of them is an urban reserve on old federal land that was owned by the military in the heart of the regional center. And again, that's another sad story of institutional systematic racism. The Turtle Grove area had a Mi'kmaq band for time in memoriam, and they were wiped out by the Halifax explosion in 1917. Most of them did not survive, and the federal government and the province and the municipality at the time said, well, that solves that, and took the land away. And so that has been returned, and we are working with that band on developing it as a part of the Shannon Park development. We're working with the Mi'kmaq Native Friendship Center to build, and Christina, you talked about needing a center and a place to meet. So we have an ambition to have a nation-leading friendship center for Mi'kmaq and other First Nations people, because as the largest city in Atlantic Canada, a major federal military base, we have a lot of First Nations people from across the country as well, and we hoped to see that under construction within the next year or two. The city's been at the table for a couple of years. The province and the Fed started announcing money the last 2 weeks. So we're hopeful that finally happens, and a lot of other stuff. And there too, it's when you get down into the tactical level, we're having these conversations, we're meeting regularly, we're building friendship accords and communications protocols. But one of the requests we've heard repeatedly was, you need to rename streets and name them. We want to see our culture reflected in street names and park names, and our GIS system could not handle street names that had apostrophes in them, which is one of the key parts of writing most First Nations languages and Mi'kmaq. And so we had to resource at budget and upgrade to the software so we could actually do what the community requested. And of course we did that, and it's done now, and we can do that. But all those things.
Shame on Esri to not make sure that their software. I hope Alex is on the call and will immediately remedy that so that we can make sure that these are much more culturally appropriate GIS tools. I want to go, if I can, for a second to money, because I appreciate that each of you has talked about specific things that you're able to do. But what we heard from Christina and from Cynthia to a certain extent too is just there's an element of fatigue here, and communities are doing all this work, and it's not really their job to make up for centuries of discrimination. So I'm interested about, if I could hear from Mayor Helps potentially, how do we avoid the tragedy that people invest tons of time and energy to try to chart their own path, to reemerge, as you said, Christina, in their own territory, and then we don't actually commit the resources to implement the plans that communities come up with. I'm wondering what, Lisa, you would say, and then maybe Councillor Mason, if both of you as elected leaders, about how we influence other orders of government to invest. First to you, Mayor Helps.
Yeah, well, I mean, the answer is really simple. We find the resources to implement the plans that communities have come up with. It's if we're serious about the work that we're doing, then there has to be funding and resources behind it. So just a couple of examples.
Who's the we when you say we find them?
All of us, the local government, and then where appropriate, the federal government and the provincial government and local taxpayers. And I can talk more about the city's reconciliation contribution fund in a moment, but I think there's a couple of examples. So Christina gave a really good one. The Indigenous Prosperity Center is being, what's the word, nurtured, I guess. Why don't we say nurtured, but incubated at CIP. So that the Indigenous Prosperity Center has all of the resources of CIP behind it. And CIP is working hard to find, alongside obviously the 5 co-chairs in the committee, to find—
Lisa, just explain to people how CIP is funded.
So CIP is the South Island Prosperity Partnership, and it is a public-private Indigenous partnership. So it's funded by local governments, businesses. It's our regional economic development entity, and so that is a real example. And Christina can speak more about this because she's way more involved than I am in the Indigenous Prosperity Center, where CIP is taking some of the resources that it has gathered from all of us and putting them towards the Indigenous Prosperity Center and helping the Indigenous Prosperity Center find funding from the federal and provincial governments. So that's how you do it. You do it by doing it. You don't just do it by making a plan and then letting it sit on a shelf. Another couple of examples here in the city, we created, and this panel was featured. They did such a good job at CUIX Victoria, the Welcoming City Task Force. So we created a task force to make Victoria more welcoming and less racist, with people who are newcomers to Canada or who have been here for a long time and still don't feel like the city is welcoming enough. So we put consulting dollars, we put city dollars towards getting a consultant, so it's not the community just doing the work off the side of their desks. And then there was a strategy adopted by council, and now we've put the strategy, put dollars behind it in the 2022 budget, and we've created an equity, diversity, and inclusion office and hired 4 people to come and do the work at the city. And we pay people. There's the International Decade of People of African Descent. Mary, I know I'm talking really quick. But International Decade of People of African Descent, the city declared the UN decade 2014 to 2024. We've created an International Decade of People of African Descent task force. We pay them for their time and their work to do the work. We've given them funding to give out in the community in a grant form. So city money that goes through that committee out into the community, people of African descent. So, I mean, I could go on. I have more examples. You do it by doing it. That's it.
Yep. I mean, she nailed it. The who pays for it, you got to live your convictions. So the example with the Friendship Center is normally when it's a not-for-profit coming to us for money, we try and encourage them to only ask for us to give them 10 or 20% of the project, because we only get 10% of the taxes compared to the feds in the province. And then with the Friendship Center, that land's probably worth $20 million. It'll be like 40-50% of the project. It's pretty hard to argue about land payment with a First Nations group, right? It's like, okay, you want that land? Well, that's your land. So, okay. And that's what's going to happen. We're going to donate that land, and that'll be a big part of our contribution. And that would not happen that wouldn't happen in other situations.
I think you've got a tough road ahead of you though, because I think the feds gave you $5 million on a $65 million project, right? You got a bit of a ways to go there, Wei. I mean, I listen, go team, go team, go. I hear you, but I guess I hear both of you signaling this, that you have to be serious about the commitment that we have to actually, I mean, talk is cheap, as we've been saying, right? And so I guess, Christina, I'm interested through the South African Partnership, but also through Carolyn Hilton's work on the actual power of the Indigenous economy. Do you see a shift happening in terms of Indigenous-led businesses? What's your sense of what the key challenges are there? What should this national audience hear from you in terms of what you're experiencing? And then I'll pass back to Abigail.
We're at such an interesting time right now, because there is kind of a reaching critical mass where where capacity is meeting opportunity. So there are enough people in positions where they can make change in government and in institutions. There's enough people now to start making a difference. And there's enough on the Indigenous side, there's enough people at this stage that are working hard at it. So we have an army of people across this country that are creating change, like we're hearing talked about right now. And I think that, the critical events, George Floyd, the finding of the children at the residential schools, were both watershed moments for Canada. And it felt a bit like a great big wound, like the bandage had been ripped off and we have a huge wound in the country. And the only way to clean that wound is to tell the truth. And so, people hearing about Africville and people hearing about residential schools and hearing about the truth of what happened, because we did such a good job in our school systems of tamping that down and talking about it like it's ancient history. But even in First Nations communities, it was like, yeah, residential schools was a really bad thing. And everybody knows it had intergenerational effects. But when they were finding the burials, people were realizing, this isn't our history. This is now. This is my mother, my grandmother, my I would have had an uncle, but he died in residential school. This is now. The impacts are now. So it's an important time for us. So I think that those watershed moments helped shift the mindset of individual people, and it's brought us, I believe, I hope, to that critical mass where change can happen, and where those people, frankly, to put it frankly, people are using their white privilege within the systems to create space for us to bring in other voices and other ways of doing things. And that really is why I think that we are where we are.
Thanks. Abigail, over to you.
Yeah, so I wanted to, I think, picking up on what Christina said, that idea of using power, white privilege to create space. I'm wondering, one of the challenges right now that Halifax has been experiencing, it's all over the country, is housing crisis. And this morning we learned a little bit more just in terms of the migration in, the crisis of housing, and just wondering, Councillor Mason, if you could perhaps start with that really shortly, and I'm going to turn over to Cynthia. If you could talk a little bit about what is happening with the housing crisis, specifically thinking about the demographics that are both challenged.
Well, when I got elected and the mayor got elected in 2012, all the kids were going to move to Fort McMurray, and the center of gravity in Atlantic Canada was moving to Moncton, and our city was doomed. And now we had a very deliberate set of actions to turn all that around, and we've exceeded safely, I can say that we've exceeded our wildest expectations. So we now have these success problems, as I've heard them referred to. The population has gone from being stagnant or shrinking to growing by 10,000 people a year. And we had the fastest growing downtown last year. Victoria and Halifax and a couple other cities are usually, you know, the fastest second or third growing city in our total population. And who comes here, who we've been able to attract in a lot of cases are ocean-based stuff, biotech, and IT-based stuff, and those pay a lot, right? So if you have someone who's moving here who's in their late 20s, early 30s and makes low six figures, and they just sold their house and got the equity bump in Parkdale or Hamilton, in Toronto or Hamilton or something, they can spend a lot of money to buy a house here, and they have a lot of money to cover a mortgage here. And so there's been an interesting disparity there where, you know, the population is growing, housing always lags behind. You know, to skip to the end of the conversation so we can hear from other people, this last year, we have, right now where we're at in the last 12 months is we have 6,500 units permitted for construction. Historically, it was usually around 1,700 to 2,000 a year. So the construction and the city permitting process is starting to catch up with the demand. But because it took 4 or 5 years to catch up with the demand, market housing is way behind and rents are skyrocketing. You couple that with the other big piece, which I really have to throw in here before I stop, is there has been no social housing built in Nova Scotia in significant numbers in 20 years. And that date coincides with when the municipalities handed over social housing back to the province, who have just not done anything. And we don't have the funding, responsibility, or authority to build social housing, to do shelter, to do social services, but we you know, bear the brunt of the issues that inaction on that creates. And so, you know, we're constantly lobbying the province to do more quickly.
Can I just jump in behind that, Abigail, for a second, just say to the councillor that when we were here last fall, you had encampments. Encampments are a huge challenge for Mayor Helps as well. So at some point, I'm anticipating the summer is coming. Presumably, we're going to see people moving back outside. And as much as I'm sympathetic that you have a jurisdictional challenge where housing is actually in certain parts of the country only the provincial, as you said, it's perceived by regular folk as your problem. So I'll be interested to hear between you and Mayor Helps what your strategy is going to be for this summer, because I just, you know, as regular people, we get fed up with government saying, well, it's not my fault, you know, and I'm just wondering how we can move forward beyond sort of blaming the other jurisdiction. Cynthia, I don't want to cut you off if you want to say something about housing.
Let's come back to that. I want to hear from Cynthia.
Okay, you can come back to it. Sure. Go ahead, Cynthia.
Yeah, I would love to actually have a discussion around housing. In regards to housing, especially in the African Nova Scotian community, and we've seen this in the Aboriginal community, because of COVID, you realize, I think the government, provincial government, as well as our jurisdictions, municipal jurisdictions, realized the impact COVID was having in these two communities more so than other communities. Communities that have privilege where you have one family living in one house. When we look at the Aboriginal community, we look at the African Nova Scotian communities, sometimes we have multiple generations living in a house. So there is a crisis in the fact that when you can have a lot more people having the ability to have one family, one house, and we have issues with the Aboriginal community as well as the African Nova Scotian community where we don't have the ability to do that. And some of this is not just, it's not because of 20 years ago, we had the social housing removed and moved back to government. I don't think social housing is the issue or the main issue. I think it's really, how are we dealing with the historical injustices in these two communities? And it's not about whose fault it is. I think it's lobbying on both sides of the yard, both municipal as well as provincial, to say these were inequities, these were injustices. How do we start correcting these and righting the ship? Because it's not going to right until both parties, both at the federal level, municipal level, get together to say, this is what we're going to do to correct this issue, so that everyone has the decency and the respect to have an opportunity to own a home, live in a home as a single family instead of multi-family, multi-generational families living together. Because if you're not given those opportunities, then we're not having the life or the livelihood that most people get to have. And that's not fair to, from a societal perspective, that's not fair to all of us.
Thanks.
So if I may, to answer your question, Mary, and to build on what Cynthia said, I mean, I fundamentally agree with what Cynthia is saying. The municipality is doing, like, we spent $5 million on emergency housing by putting modulars on 2 sites that are going to provide, and the province is paying for the programming to do supportive housing, because a lot of the people who are living in those encampments are folks who have challenges renting anything, even in a normal market. They're folks who have drug or mental health issues in some cases, not in all cases. So we have 2 streams, right? You have a complete failure to adequately address the needs of the people who are most vulnerable and need the most supports. And then you have something which is new to us, which is people who have jobs that are low waged, that just can't find a place they can afford. And so you know, we want to see both of those addressed. We've been focusing on people who are living rough and who have those real challenges. And so the other thing, the municipality, the other 2 things are, we've supported federal rapid housing funding, which thank goodness was not being screened through the province, which meant we were able to actually move things forward relatively quickly. And there's about 250 units coming in that, in a variety of supportive and non-supportive roles. Areas. And in the other one, which council debated 2 weeks ago, which didn't sit well with some of my colleagues, but to me is the only thing we can do, is we are going to recognize and designate some tenting sites, but with, you know, 4 or 5 tents per site, providing porta potties and hand washing stations, and making sure human rights are being met. But you know, the court's been quite clear: if there's nowhere for people to go, you can't kick them out of a park. But that, so we need to, right now, where we don't have adequate housing for both people with low wages and people who have these challenges, we need to recognize that safety valve, as much as I dislike it, has to be supported in some way.
We're seeing some action in the chat here, Abigail, about multifamily versus, do you want to, I'll pass it to you first.
Okay, I was actually going to pivot a bit from housing. So the question I was going to ask was just around thinking about how do we move forward in a way when we think about the capacity. I'm thinking within the city. I believe both cities seem to have offices for looking at DEI, so diversity, equity, inclusion. And you know, there's been a budget given to create these offices. And in our discussions with HRM staff who work on these initiatives, they've been, one of the concerns is just about capacity. There's so much work to be done, but they're limited in capacity. And there's just questions around like how their ability to influence policy change in terms of structurally how they're located. So I'm curious to know, how do we keep track of progress? How do we go back to community to talk about the progress of work that's being done? And how do we also support staff internally to do this work? And so that it's actually embedded within city policy and practices.
I'm wondering if Lisa could maybe start. Why don't we hear about how Victoria's been tackling it? Go ahead, Lisa.
Sure. So our Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion Office is still new, and you're right, they're very overworked because everybody in every department is asking them for insight, for advice. And so our city manager took, I think, a really creative approach, the same approach that we took to climate change, which is that we're not going to have one department be in charge of climate change. It's going to be spread among all the departments. And so what the EDI office folks are doing now is engaging with training, empowering people in engineering and public works, in planning, in parks, so that everybody can learn, good hiring practices and culturally appropriate ways of dealing with conflict. And so it's to push EDI training and understanding and capacity into all of the departments. So it's not a small group of people who are responsible for making it happen. So that is starting to work. The other thing, and again, I have some very impatient colleagues on council who want to see everything happen all at once. And so I feel that council is putting undue pressure on the EDI office. And so what I've tried to do is work closely with them myself, with the folks in EDI, to say, what can the mayor's office support with? Okay, you don't want to be sending out agendas and meeting invitations and following up with minutes. Great, let's have my office do that. So anything that we can kind of take away some of the administrative stuff so that they can do the work that's important. And then one other thing that we did in our budget this year is we hired an additional committee secretary to provide some support to that office again, so that they're doing the real work and not the busy work, because that's what we need them to do. So those are some strategies at the city.
Oh, that's great. And I had one follow-up question for you, if Mayor helps. Is there, I guess, do they participate on the management table, the senior leadership? How does the EDI office kind of connect to the mayor's office formally in terms of voting and making decisions around city policy? So accountability is a question.
Yeah, that's a great question. So our city manager recognized the importance of equity, diversity, and inclusion, and the EDI team reports directly to the deputy city manager. So it reports kind of right to the top, as it were, and has that support from the city manager's office as well. And then in terms of the mayor's office, I co-chair the Welcoming City Advisory Committee, which they thought that they were just going to come and help us develop a strategy. And then once the strategy was here, they didn't want to stop. They wanted to keep meeting. So we've institutionalized them, and I co-chair that committee. And then I also sit as an advisor to the a witness, I guess, supporter to the International Decade of People of African Descent committee. So there's a direct connection to those committees and to the staff in the EDI office from my office through the support to those committees. And those are committees of citizens and residents and business owners.
Great. Thank you. Thank you. Councillor Mason, would you mind just talking a bit about how that looks in Halifax, and specifically in thinking about the relationship to the mayor's office and accountability for DEI, and how you think that could either change or if it's working well or not?
Well, I think that the big change that was made, that was something that was pushed for by councillors and the mayor, was that the Office of Diversity and Inclusion reports directly to the CAO again, where it had been kind of moved down over time to be 3 or 4 layers down, reporting to a manager, report to a director, report to the CAO. It's too important to do that. And indeed, that was part of the commitment in the Africville settlement that saw the historic church rebuilt and the land transferred, that would not happen, that would be the ANZIO, African Nova Scotia office, would report directly to the CAO and have that access. So that's been fixed. And then on the political side, we've started to assign portfolios effectively. So I'm the Indigenous community liaison for when the mayor is unavailable. Tony Mancini, Pam Lovelace, the deputy mayor right now, is to the Acadian community. And we don't have a formal one because we were blessed by having 2 African Nova Scotians elected to council right now, Councillor Stoddard and Councillor Smith, who do a tremendous amount of, frankly, an overwhelming amount of work supporting those communities on top of everything else they have to do as councillors. So I feel like that part, but I want to go back to something Mayor Help said, to tie it back into this idea of you just got to do the right thing. I would argue a bragging point in Halifax for 25 years has been that when you look at the Calgary Tax and Utility Study, which the mayor will be familiar with, we're always in the bottom 25%, the bottom quarter in terms of tax paid per home. Per single family home. And I have started to come to believe, and this is a very unpopular and politically suicidal thing, that taxes are in fact too low. If you want to do all these things, if the councillors want to commit to doing these things, most of the councillors most vocal about why aren't we doing things faster also vote to keep taxes as low as possible or cut them whenever possible. And you just, if you want to do these things, you got to have the money. And that was the big fight we had around the environmental plan we just funded this year, is we had to raise taxes to fund that, and we managed to do it. So I expect the same on these issues.
Do you know this famous quote of Oliver Wendell Holmes, "I pay my taxes, it buys me civilization." I mean, I think that, as you say, Councillor, we have a kind of allergy to this, but I guess the question that a number of us question is who should be collecting and dispersing the taxes, I guess is the question. And could we get more resources in the hands of local governments, where you're the closest to the challenges and we believe closest to the best solutions. In the minutes that we have time left, I'm wondering if each of you could just quickly speak to something that I think is pretty profound that we're seeing in cities around the world, and that is polarization. And what role do you think your work, whether it's placemaking or local economic development or whatever particular piece that you want to highlight, where do you think the role is for us as city builders in trying to see if we can stitch together this kind of collective narrative in a city? I'll start with you, Christina, if I could.
Yeah, I was thinking as Mayor Helps was sharing that some of the decisions that they've made are make racism flare up. And it's hard to tell what percentage of the population, because the social media that where many get information from is definitely swayed to the side of very negative feedback. So for each sort of positive step, there has been a backlash, and much of the backlash goes to the nations directly, like phone calls, right? Just abuse, right? Directly to the nation. So we're seeing that polarization. When we had some youth came into downtown Victoria and took down the statue of Cook and tossed it in the water, and our community members started to experience racist abuse just out walking around, and they became afraid. And so I was witnessing this on Facebook, where people were starting to form, like women didn't want to go anywhere by themselves, and people were forming little groups to go anywhere. And people were reporting, I had someone scream at me out of their car when I was standing at a crosswalk, and all of these things. So a lot of fear came out. So what ended up happening was that nine out of 10 chiefs on the South Island came together and wrote a letter stating that the pulling down of that statue is not how they wish things were done, and that's not their way, and we want to do things peacefully. Because another retaliation that had happened with that statue coming down, someone drove up to the Malahat and lit a totem pole on fire. So it was a real flashpoint. And as much as that it's awful to go through those flashpoints, they do help people understand that racism is alive and well, and we're dealing with it daily. So it flushed it out, but it's frightening to live through. And that was the first time I've seen 9 chiefs come together on the South Island on any topic ever in 27 years. And they came together to try to make their community members feel safe to go to the store in their own city. So it really speaks to how polarized things are. It's quite true.
Yeah. And then some kind of collective step. I wonder if I could go to Cynthia next, and then we'll swing back to the two electeds. Go ahead, Cynthia.
I think this whole issue around polarization, understand a lot of it is via the media, social media in particular. I think there's a small number of people who drive it, but they drive it large. We have to go back and look at the fact that Canada, although a very large country, was formed over hundreds of years, and different pieces were formed in different ways. And I will say this, I always find east of the Great Lakes, the oldest part of Canada, 400 plus years old, with colonizers coming in and newcomers coming in. But again, a lot of it was built on the fact of the backs of enslavement. It was built on marginalization. It was built on racism. There was legislation and laws that prohibited people from doing things right up until, and if I look at the African Nova Scotian context or the Black context, up until the Civil Rights Movement. And in 1964, when the Civil Rights Act was signed in the States, all of a sudden Canada said, oh, well, we have to comply as well, because things that were happening south of the border were happening north of the border. And, at the end of the day, we have to realize that's only 58 years ago. And things haven't gotten all that much better. We paint a picture, but when you start to move the picture, you do see the cracks and the major cracks in the armor. And I think we have to be aware that we have to build hope for the future, for the next generation, for the youth that are here now. And how do we build hope? We have to be open, we have to be honest, and we have to root out polarization. And we have to acknowledge, if it happens, how do we address this as a collective, from the federal government, provincial government, municipal governments? How do you address it? And making sure you stand by the folks and not only stand by them, but support them and have a voice for them and lobby.
Mm-hmm.
So I think a lot of this boils down to how we, and it's not the government by itself doing it. You have to go back to the community to find out the impact it's having on the community. And then from there, work with the community, because it's still going to continue to happen. It's how we address it as a collective, and how we address it in a way that's meaningful to the community, so that we make the community whole. And that's the most important thing. If we don't make the community whole, then it's for naught. So I don't think that government can say things outside of an isolation of the community. I think they have to work with the community.
Of course, they are community. Yeah, it's we've got no time left, so I'm going to ask each councillor and Mayor House. Almost impossible for politicians to do this, to just give us one sentence each as we wrap up. Go ahead. First to you, Councillor Mason.
Stay off of Twitter. Like,
Right.
I've never seen anything like it on both the left and the right. It's just,
Yeah, I hear you.
it's mean, and people are so solid
And
in their bubbles,
it's
they think everyone
polarizing.
agrees with
Yeah.
them.
It's polarizing. We have to get off Twitter and get into place, get back our feet back on the
Face to
ground.
face.
Mayor
Yep.
helps. Mayor helps. One sentence from you.
Read a book called Dialogue and the Art of Thinking Together by William Isaacs. Highly recommend.
Thanks, Mayor Helps. Mayor Helps is always so good. She puts stuff into the chat. So maybe a link, one of our staff can put a link into the chat, or we'll put it up online somewhere, a link to Mr. Isaac's book. And, or Nick may even be, he's already ahead of me. Thanks, Nick. Listen, thanks for joining us, folks. Such a great conversation. Glad to be back on City Talk, to be able to have these kinds of coast to coast conversations. And I always feel we could go on for a lot longer. We'll post this. It'll be online. We'll do a transcript as we always do, and some highlights. I just want to thank a whole bunch of people. First of all, the other thing is I want to plug this Victoria report. Make sure you read this Victoria Nurtures report. It's online now, and it's startling, and it's confronting, and it's inspiring. You'll really benefit from having a look at it. You can find in the link that Nick will have put into the chat, and there will be coming to you soon some kind of a report also that will hopefully highlight the same level of discourse that we've had here in Halifax. TD Bank supports City Talk across all our programming platforms. Thanks for their support. And then thanks to the City of Victoria and the Victoria Foundation that helped us do CUI Victoria last year and helped us produce this report. We never lose anybody's phone number, as I say at CUI. So we're always glad to continue to have this discussion. You can see even our former staff, don't forget, as Jamie was on, as I said. And we've had many partners here for CUI Halifax. Abigail's been helping us. Cynthia, our board member, has been helping us. And then we have Develop Nova Scotia as one of the underwriters and partners every step of the way with us on this. And also the Halifax Public Library, in which we're located in in the main branch, but we've been in their branches all week. And they are, of course, the great civic square, libraries across the country promoting civic discourse. And we hope knitting together and helping us, as we suggested, as you said, some of the wounds you mentioned, Cynthia, helping us heal some of these wounds that we've had so communities can emerge, and that we have a shared civic space, and that we address that polarization directly through a shared place and a shared space. So thanks for joining us. Hope you have a lovely weekend. And we'll be back to you on City Talk in a couple more weeks. I think we're going to focus on housing. Really great to have you, Mayor Helps. Christina, always great to see you. Thanks, Cynthia, for all your help this week. Councillor Mason, wonderful to meet you. Abigail's been tremendous with us as a fellow journeyer through this, and we look forward to seeing you soon. Thanks, everybody.
Bye, everyone.